The border between Norway and Russia consists of 195.7-kilometer land border between Sør-Varanger, Norway and Pechengsky District, Russia, and a 23.2-kilometer marine border in the Varangerfjord. It further consists of a border between the two countries' exclusive economic zones in the Barents Sea in the Arctic Ocean. Between 1944 and 1991 the border was between Norway and the Soviet Union. There is a single border crossing on E105, located at Storskog in Norway and Borisoglebsky in Russia. The Norwegian side is patrolled by the garrison of Sør-Varanger and is under the jurisdiction of the Norwegian Border Commissioner, while the Russian side is patrolled by the Border Guard Service of Russia. Two-thirds of the border follows two rivers, the Pasvikelva and Jakobselva. The border was defined as a march in a treaty in 1326 and separated which parts of the Sami could be taxed by Norway and Russia. The border line was defined by a treaty in 1826 and essentially remains the same border today. In 1920 Petsamo was ceded to Finland and the border became part of the Finland-Norway border. Petsamo was ceded to the Soviet Union in 1944 and the Norway-Soviet Union border was established. During the Cold War, the border was one of two between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union, the other being the Soviet Union-Turkey border. From 1991 to 1999 it was the only border between Russia and NATO. It is Norway's youngest unchanged border. Since the 1960s there has been disagreement as to the border between the two countries' EEZs, but this was resolved by a delimitation agreement in 2010. History. Open border. For the 11th century Olaf III of Norway regarded the borders of Norway as reaching to the White Sea. The first Norwegians started moving to Finnmark in the 13th century. Vardø's fortress was erected by Norway in 1300 further east than today's land border, supporting Norwegian land ownership on the Varanger Peninsula. There were no permanent Norwegian settlements on the Kola Peninsula. In 1326 Norway and the Novgorod Republic signed an agreement regarding taxation of the Kola Peninsula and Finnmark. No border line was drawn, creating a marchland where both countries held the right to taxation of the Sami. Religiously motivated Russian colonization of the jointly taxed areas started in the 16th century, and Russian Orthodox chapels were built at Niden, Pechengsky and Borisoglebsky. This accelerated the need for a specific border line. In 1582 Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible declared the Kola Bay part of Russia, later specifying that Russia claimed all of Lapland. He further proposed that a new border line be drawn up. Denmark. Norway's King Frederick II responded by renewing the Norwegian claim to all land to the White Sea. His successor Christian IV travelled along the Finnmark coast in 1599 to increase the weight of the claims. As part of the Treaty of Nord in 1613, Sweden abandoned all claims in Finnmark. The Dano-Norwegian government took the initiative to establish a border line in 1789. Russian authorities agreed, but because of the Russo-Turkish War no work was undertaken. New Dano-Norwegian requests were raised in 1793, 1797, and 1809, without action from the Russian counterpart. Norway joined a union with Sweden in 1814, and 2 years later King Carl John again tried to start negotiations, without success. In 1825, however, a common Norwegian and Russian commission was established to draw a border line. resulting in a report on a map which was approved by both countries' authorities. The treaty was signed in St. Petersburg on 14 May 1826, and the following summer border poles were laid along the border. The Tollweg principle was followed in the Jakobselva and Pasvikelva rivers. Along the land borders, the boundary markers were laid at a distance of 6 Allen or 5 Arshen. The border remains Norway's youngest unchanged border and Russia's oldest. The border was reviewed in 1846. A cairn was constructed at Krokfjellet, and the land border from the sea to Gulmsø was cleared. The marker at the mouth of the Jakobselva was gone and had to be rebuilt, while several others had to be repaired. It was agreed that there would be a review every 25 years, which was formalized through a declaration the following year. Some markers were repaired in 1857, and new reviews were carried out in 1871 and 1896. In the latter year, the width of the cleared area increased to 8 meters. Maps were created for the entire border line in 1 to 42,000 scale and in 1 to 8,400 scale for the area immediately surrounding each marker. A partial review was carried out between Nidin and the Tana River in 1912. Up until the 1940s, the border had been open, without border controls. Farmers at Grens Jakobselv, for instance, did not need to worry about whether or not their cattle were on the correct side of the border. During the late 19th century, customs checkpoints were established at Eivindgh and Grens Jakobselv. Norwegian authorities gave permission for customs-free transit of wares along Pasvikelva. There was a limited amount of trans-border trade, and import for personal use under certain volumes was customs-free. This was accelerated by significantly lower prices in Russia compared to Norway. From 1902 to 1917, the border crossing was used to smuggle revolutionary Russian literature into Russia. The material was printed at Finnmarkens printing press in Vadsø and smuggled over the border by boat. During World War I, 6 soldiers were stationed at Nyborgmoen in Nesseby as neutrality guards. This was gradually increased so that by 1918 there were 93 soldiers stationed in Sør-Varanger to guard the border. Finland declared its independence from Russia following the October Revolution, which was followed up with the 1920 Treaty of Tartu, which ceded Petsamo to Finland, thus giving Finland access to the Barents Sea. This resulted in Norway and the Soviet Union no longer having a common border. The planned 1921 review was not carried out. A treaty regarding the border was signed between Finland and Norway on 28 April 1924, replacing the 1826 treaty, but not changing the border line. A review was carried out in 1925. The border line at the mouth of the Jakobselva was revised on 12 September 1931, and new markers were placed in June 1939. Closing the border, the Moscow Armistice of 1944 and the Paris Peace Treaties 1947 ceded Petsamo and other Finnish areas to Russia. During World War II, northern Norway served as the staging area for the German attack on Murmansk. The Soviet Union made an excursion over the border in 1944 in the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive, which aimed to extinguish the German military forces in the area. Soviet forces took the town of Kirkenes, which had been evacuated by the Germans, who used scorched earth tactics. On 24 October 1944, Soviet troops continued west to Tana, but withdrew in September 1945. The ceding of Petsamo from Finland to the Soviet Union had no effect on the border, as the Soviet Union by default inherits the old border line. A common commission was created to review the border, with negotiations taking place from 1 to 16 August 1946. The field review took place between the 1st of July and the 4th of September 1947. Norway initially proposed using cairns to mark the border, but the Soviet Union wanted to use the same method as along its other borders, with wooden markers, each 2 meters from the border line. There was to be a free line of sight from each pair of markers to the next. The idea initially met resistance from Norwegian authorities of cost reasons, but they soon agreed on the principle to reduce unintentional border crossings. Markers in soil were dug down 2 meters and markers on bedrock were fastened with 4 bolts. Border checkpoints were established at Sør-Varanger and Borisoglebsky. Geodesic measurements were undertaken to establish the border in accordance with the Bessel ellipsoid. The entire border area was mapped in 1 to 20,000. The Soviet authorities made proposals to change the border. The first was an equal exchange of land at Skollfoss, but this was rejected by the Norwegian authorities as the proposed ceding was valuable for hydroelectricity. At Grensefoss, Norway owned land on both sides of the border, but there was no interest by the Norwegian authorities to change the border as they wanted it to remain the same as from 1826. The border along Klistavation and Falseverton was set based on the maps from 1896. At the mouth of Jakobselva, the maps from 1896 were of poor quality in combination, with the Talweg having shifted since 1896. The Talweg line would create problems from the settlement at Grense Jakobselv, as they no longer would be able to use the harbour or have free access to the sea. The countries therefore agreed on a new line based on a Norwegian proposal, in exchange for the Soviet Union receiving 3 islets, including Kistholmen and Brennholmen, in the Pasvik River. The marine border within the territorial waters was established by a protocol signed on the 15th of February 1957. It was marked with 2 lead markers and originally stretched 4 nautical miles. Cold War. During the Soviet era, the border was guarded by the Soviet border troops. The border was one of the 2 land borders between NATO and the Soviet Union, the other being the Soviet Union-Turkey border. This ensured that Russia-Norway border relations were a relevant matter for other NATO allies. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was considered Norway's main enemy, and Norway maintained a large military presence on the border. Norwegian government plans for the defensive Finnmark against the Soviet Union during the Cold War were based on using scorched earth tactics in the event of the Soviets crossing the border. The whole county of Finnmark was regarded by NATO as a buffer zone. Norwegian military leaders regarded the population in the county as potentially unreliable, and did not trust that they would be willing to defend the country against intruders. On account of the county's special ethnic and political composition, specifically Sami people and a higher number of communist sympathizers than elsewhere. On the Norwegian side, the border was from 1948 to 1950 patrolled by the National Mobile Police Service. From 1950 the responsibility was transferred to Sør-Varanger Police District, who received 25 officers from around the country. For the 15th of July 1955 the responsibility was taken over by the Norwegian Border Commission, who had 9 outpost sergeants and 42 officers. This was terminated on the 29th of December 1958, when the responsibility was transferred to the Norwegian Army, who created the garrison of Sør-Varanger. Initially, all meetings between the Norwegian and Soviet commissioners and the staff was held at the Storskog-Borisoglebsky crossing. The Soviets quickly bought a small cabin to host meetings. If the meeting was initiated by the Soviets, it was held in the premises, while it was held outdoors if initiated by the Norwegians, unless circumstances dictated that it had to be held indoors. This caused the Norwegian authorities to build a conference room on the side of the border, which opened in 1956. Initially, meetings between the two commissioners would be called by hoisting a flag, a red lamp at the border, and the other country's soldiers would alert the commissioner, who would meet within 2 hours. Later a telephone connection was installed and the parties agreed on 2 hours each weekday that they were to be available along with an interpreter. Initially the Soviet commissioner was based in Salmijarvi, but later moved to Nikel. The area on both sides of the river saw an increased industrialization, especially Sør-Varanger in Norway and Pechengsky in Russia. This raised the question of utilizing Pasvik Elven for hydroelectricity. An agreement was signed in 1957 which would result in the construction of 4 power stations, the Pechengsky River hydroelectric plants, of which 2 were owned by each of the countries. All 4 were built by Norwegian contractors, and as the sites were all built on both sides of the border, they required increased flexibility of border crossing procedures. This was further complicated by the workers not having a sense of the border being closed and frequent, innocent transgressions of the border protocols. The power plants opened between 1963 and 1978. Up until the power plants opened, the river had been used for log driving from Finland to the sawmill at Eivindgh, which was permitted according to the border treaty. There have been a limited number of illegal crossings of the border. For instance, an American in 1947 and a German in 1964 both received a few weeks in detention and smaller fines. During the summer of 1965, a trial was made whereby Norwegian could visit the Borisoglebsky without a visa. This was organized by the creation of a separate border checkpoint at Sør-Varanger. Although this was intended only for the local population, the 27-year-old American tourist newcomer chose to cross the border illegally and met up at a Soviet border post and demanded a stamp. He was sentenced to 1.5 years in a labor camp, but was later found dead on a train. This, combined with vodka traffic, the visa-free crossing created and concerns of recruitment of Soviet spies, made Norwegian authorities terminate the Sør-Varanger crossing and the visa-free project later that year. A Soviet border provocation on the 7th of June 1968, together with the invasion of Czechoslovakia that year and a general increase in Soviet military activity on the Norwegian border, contributed to a large increase in the funding for the Norwegian military presence on the border. Yet the Russia-Norway border is the only one of Russia's borders where an open war between the two bordering countries has not taken place. Proposals for conservation of the Norwegian part of Pasvik Delen was first launched by Carl Skogen in 1936. An area of 51 square kilometers was preserved in 1951 and OVRE Pasvik National Park was created in 1970. With a slightly smaller area, the park was expanded to 119 square kilometers in 2003. On the 7th of December 1971, the two countries signed a protocol regarding protection of the fisheries in Jakobselven and Pasvikelven. In the late 1970s, Norway, inspired by Finland, considered replacing the wooden poles with fiberglass as this would make them more durable and reduce maintenance. 2 poles were replaced in 1979 and remained at the turn of the millennium. However, the authorities concluded that wooden poles were more suitable and more durable in relation to human contact, as Norway, unlike Russia and Finland, allows people to travel up to the border. In 1989 there were 2,000 border crossings. increased traffic. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 caused the Norway-Soviet Union border to become the Norway-Russia border. This resulted in a more liberal border crossing policy, which saw the number of crossings increase to 80,000 by 1992. For Norwegian authorities, this meant that police and customs authorities would have to be regularly stationed at the border. A large amount of the initial traffic was from Russians who sold crafts and souvenirs at markets and fairs throughout Finnmark. From 1992, Norwegian authorities introduced limitations on the activity, resulting in a reduction in trans-border traffic. However, by 1998 the traffic had nearly hit 100,000. From 1991 to 1999, Norway was the only NATO country to share a land border with Russia. This caused a decrease in Allied interest in Norway's border issue, leaving Norway more to itself in managing the relationship. Cooperation concerning conservation of nature started in 1990. It was initially a Norwegian proposal to protect the important bird area and Lake Fjærvann, and resulted in a joint Norwegian and Russian Pacific Nature Reserve. The Russian part was formally established in 1992 and the Norwegian part the following year. In 2003 a new border station was opened at Borisoglebsky, financed by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Norway and Russia signed a protocol on the 11th of July 2007 which established the border through the Varangerfjord.It, 73 kilometers from land. In 2011 the two countries agreed to replace the wooden markers with poles made of composite materials. This was to reduce the need for maintenance, as the new markers are expected to have a lifespan up to 50 years, compared to 5 to 10 years for wooden poles. This took place at the same time as a review of the border and creation of new maps along a 2 to 3 kilometers wide corridor on both sides of the borderline. New maps were completed in 2012. Work started in 2011 on the Russian side and 2014 on the Norwegian side of the border to upgrade the E105 highway. When completed in 2017 it should reduce the travel time between Kirkenes and Murmansk by 30 minutes. In early January 2012 a third Russian checkpoint was opened on the road between Borisoglebsky and Nickel. With 4 checkpoints in 30 kilometers it set a European record. However, it was removed a month later, along with the checkpoint at Titouka. The border station at Storskog was upgraded for increased capacity with completion in April 2012. Residents of Sør-Varanger and parts of Pechengsky District can from the 29th of May 2012 visit the other country without a visa, on the condition that they do not travel outside a zone 30 to 50 kilometers from the border. Delimitation Agreement negotiations on the outside marine border were initiated in 1970. Norway claimed, in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Article 15 and the Convention on the High Seas, that the border should follow the equidistance principle, the border being defined by midpoints between the nearest land area or islands, as is normal practice internationally. The Soviet Union claimed, based on a decision by Joseph Stalin from 1926, which was not recognized by any other country than the Soviet Union, that a sector principle should apply, such that the border should follow meridian lines. Most of the disputed area was within what would normally be considered Norwegian according to the relevant international treaties. In 1975 the two countries agreed upon a moratorium moratorium prohibiting exploration for oil and gas in the disputed area. In 1978, a temporary agreement regulating fishery in a 60,000 square kilometers zone, named the Grey Zone in some documents from the same period, was signed, which has since been renewed annually. For the Norwegian side, the agreement was negotiated by Labour Party politician Jens Eivindgh and his protégé André Holt, who was later exposed as a Soviet spy and convicted of high treason. The agreement was highly controversial in Norway. Many Norwegians believed that Eivindgh and André Holt gave too many concessions to the Soviet Union, and that they were motivated by Soviet sympathies. The agreement caused consternation in parliament and government, and Eivindgh had difficulty receiving acceptance from his own government, where many held the opinion that he had exceeded his authority. The opposition criticized him for having accepted less than Norway's rightful claim. Holt, who was then serving a 20-year sentence, admitted in 1990 that he had acted as an informer for the Soviet negotiators. The arrest and conviction of Holt in 1984 and 1985 had a devastating effect on Eivindgh, who withdrew completely from public life in Norway. In 1989, Eivindgh compared Holt to Vidkun Quisling. During a meeting in Oslo on the 27th of April 2010, President of Russia Dmitry Medvedev and Prime Minister of Norway Jens Stoltenberg announced that the territorial dispute in the Barents Sea was settled. The agreement is a compromise which divides a disputed area of around 175,000 square kilometers into two approximately equally sized parts. The agreement was signed on the 15th of September 2010 in Murmansk by Medvedev and Stoltenberg. The Parliament of Norway unanimously approved the treaty on the 8th of February 2011. The debate lasted only an hour, and all representatives of Norwegian political parties praised the agreement. On the 30th of March, Russia's State Duma also voted in support of ratification, despite strong opposition from Communist Party representatives. Medvedev signed a law ratifying the treaty on the 8th of April 2011. The law was titled Federal Law on Ratification of the Treaty between the Russian Federation and the Kingdom of Norway on Maritime Delimitation and Cooperation in the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean. After ratification by both countries, there was a 30-day waiting period before it would come into force. The treaty entered force on the 7th of July 2011, ending the 44-year-old border dispute. The treaty stipulates conditions for fishing cooperation, providing for the retention of the mechanism to jointly regulate fishing in the Barents Sea. The treaty also defines the principles of cooperation in hydrocarbons deposits exploration. A deposit which is crossed by the maritime border may only be exploited as a whole subject to a bilateral agreement. The border treaty is economically significant, as it makes possible to conduct geological surveys and hydrocarbons drilling in the formerly disputed area, which is estimated to contain up to 6.8 billion tons of oil and gas. The area is located west of Stokmin, one of the world's largest natural gas fields. According to Anatoly Zolotakhin, Vice President of World Petroleum Council, it is a very prolific area, maybe even more prolific than Stokmin. The Norwegian company Petroleum Geoservices has been contracted to begin surveying the Norwegian part of the area in 2011. Seismic acquisition in Norway's new maritime zone started on the 8th of July 2011, and is scheduled to be completed in summer 2012. European migrant crisis and Arctic route through Storskog had emerged by September 2015 for migrants from e.g. Syria to the European Union (EEA). This route involves fewer border crossings and has no dangerous sea crossing. They use bicycles since crossing on foot is not legal here, and bus or taxi drivers are heavily penalized if transporting illegal immigrants. Between August and October 2015, the number of migrants arriving in Storskog has almost doubled every week. Norwegian police expected the number of people crossing the frontier by bicycle to reach 1,000 in 2015. As of October 31, around 2,000 migrants have entered into Norway and received temporary refugee status. Norwegian police have since increased the estimate of the number of migrants entering Norway in 2015 to reach 10,800. Geography. The river of Pasvikelva is 128 kilometers long and runs through the valley of Pasvikdalen. The river drains Finland's Lake Inari and empties into Varangerfjord at Eivindgh. After a very short section in Finland, the river runs 22 kilometers through Russia before reaching the Norway-Russia border, after which it acts as a border river for 106 kilometers. Prior to being dammed, the river consisted of 9 lakes and 15 waterfalls. It was originally possible to travel the entire length of the river by boat, but the current 7 dams make it difficult as boats must be carried past the dams. The river falls 114 meters and the entire high difference is regulated and used for hydroelectricity. Finland receives compensation for the impact on Lake Inari, which is regulated for level difference of 1.75 meters.